Hi guys, welcome to yet another episode of Microsoft ERP Beginners Tutorial Series. So in today's episode, as you can see behind me, we are going to discuss about the quarantine management process in Microsoft Dynamics 365. In the past 4 episodes, we just reviewed about the quality orders and quality management process. So the quality orders do provide us with a way to do a detailed inspection using different inspection checklists of all those incoming goods coming into the inventory from different sources. So likewise, we also have another feature called as a quarantine management, or the system automatically creates a quarantine order which also let us to segregate all those incoming stock in a separate warehouse location where we can do some visual inspection, and once they are good enough, then we can move them back to the actual warehouse. So in today's episode, we are going to review this quarantine management process in a detailed manner in Microsoft Dynamics 365. So with that note, let's get started into the episode. Hi guys, welcome back. As mentioned during the introduction, today we are going to get started with the quarantine management scenarios in Microsoft Dynamics 365. So before getting into the demo and actually performing and setting up the system for the quarantine orders, let's first get started with the introduction to the quarantine management and the scenarios that we will be covering today, and then jump back to the application and get started with the demo. So let me get into my PPT. So in the past 4 episodes, we have been covering about the quality orders, and if you are new to my channel, do watch those 4 episodes and then come back here. Only then it will be a proper continuation, and it will make more sense for you. So in the past 4 episodes, what we have performed is we have created a purchase order to receive the stock from the vendor into our warehouse location. In our case, the warehouse named was a CS warehouse, and we received the stock into the warehouse, and later on we did a quick inspection of those stocks to make sure they are of a good quality. So we have performed inspection using different inspection checklists, and this particular inspection automatically created a quality orders. We've also performed some manual quality orders on all those scenarios, and once the inspection is done and the quality order is passed, then we are moving it back as a passed inventory to the warehouse location, and then that particular stock will now be available for us to consume as a part of a sales or as a part of a master planning calculation. And likewise, all those quality orders which got failed were we used different techniques like inventory blocking to block those inventory. So inventory blocking, we used different scenarios, like we created a manual block, we created a block using a disposition code, we created a block using the inventory status, or whatever method you use. Once the inventories are blocked, then they are physically reserved from any other consumption from a sales order. In some cases, we can even literally block them from the master planning calculation. All those we have already reviewed in detail in the past 3 episodes. And other than inventory blocking, it's also possible that the failed stock gets moved to something called as a quarantine warehouse. That is, you're segregating or separating the failed stock from your actual warehouse location into a quarantine location and keep it in the quarantine location, and later you decide whether to scrap them, or until a decision is made with the vendor, just keep it in the quarantine location, just hold them. And if you want to do some corrective preventive action or any analysis, you do them all in your quarantine location. And once the conflict between the vendor and yourself is resolved, then you probably move them back to the actual warehouse and then return it to the vendor, or based on the vendor's recommendation, you can even scrap them directly from the quarantine warehouse. But we haven't covered this scenario, and we will be covering this scenario in the next episode, because in today's episode we will have a very good understanding and introduction to the quarantine management process, and then in the next episode we will cover the quarantine warehouse scenario from a quality order. Okay, today's scenario is going to be whenever you want to perform a detailed inspection, you use a concept of quality order to create a checklist and do the inspection and whether it's failing or passing it, right? But in your business process or in your company, if you're following a lot more simpler way of inspection, which is just a visual inspection, and you really do not need to perform the quality order or quality check, then in such cases you can configure a system to have a quarantine order. Meaning, when you're receiving the stock will be received directly into a separate location or separate warehouse called as a quarantine warehouse. So within this quarantine warehouse, you can perform the visual inspection, or you can perform all your analysis, and later on, once you are done with your quarantine order, once you finish your quarantine order, the stock will then be moved from your quarantine warehouse into your actual main warehouse. So if you do not have a requirement of any complex quality management process, and you really do not want to involve the quarantine orders, for you, if it is more than enough to just have a quarantine order, segregate them in a separate location, do a visual inspection. Once it's done, move them into the inventory. If you are not satisfied with certain stock, then scrap them directly from the quarantine location, that is quarantine warehouse, or maybe move them to a separate location within a main warehouse and then return it back to the vendor from there. So whatever scenario you want to use, you can use the quarantine order rather than using a quality order. Okay, so today we will be reviewing this particular scenario, meaning we'll be creating a purchase order, receiving them into the quarantine warehouse, and then finally move them back to the main warehouse. So this is the scenario that we are going to cover today. So let's get into the environment and get started with our scenario. So in order for me to get started with the quarantine management scenario, I need to do a couple of setups. They're very, very simple setup. So let me first get into the item that I want to use as a part of this demo. Let me use this item, the brake pad. And so let me get into this brake pad. Okay, once we are into the brake pad, get into the item model group, and this item model group, make sure that you enable the quarantine management checkbox. So just edit it and enable the quarantine management checkbox. So once you enable it, go back to the item, and that's the number one setup that you need to perform. So once you are done with this setup, the next one is just similar to what we have done in a transfer order scenario. If you remember, we needed a transit warehouse in order for us to perform a transfer order, which is a mandatory setup. So similarly, even for the quarantine management process, you need a quarantine warehouse, needs to be set up within a warehouse. So let's get into the inventory breakdown. So inventory management, expand all. Get into the inventory breakdown section. Let me see where it is. It's here. Get into the warehouse. That's the warehouse that we are using. That's a warehouse I'm going to use. Here I need to map the warehouse with a quarantine warehouse, just like how we map the transit warehouse for the transfer order. So in order to do that, I need to first create a quarantine warehouse. So let me quickly create a quarantine warehouse, which is, I'm going to name it as CSQ. So I'm going to same name. The only difference between the normal warehouse and the quarantine warehouse is the default, the type. Instead of default, you will change it to the quarantine. Okay, once you change this one, then that warehouse becomes a quarantine warehouse. So then you go back to the main warehouse and tag your quarantine warehouse here, and it's done. Okay, so that's the very simple two setups that you need to perform before you get started with the quarantine management process. So now let's get into the system, that is into the procurement and sourcing module, and create a purchase order. So click on the new button. Just click on the select a vendor site warehouse as usual. Going to choose that vendor. let me say, yeah, the workflow is disabled, and I'm going to choose my warehouse that has the quarantine warehouse setup done. So that's done. So let me just get into the purchase order, and now I need to add the item that actually has the quarantine checkbox checked within the item model group. So in our case, that's going to be this item. And let's to start with, let's do a simple scenario. Let's do a scenario with just one quantity, and that's going to be the price of this item. And now I can directly go ahead and receive, because the registration is not a mandatory thing for me for this particular purchase order, but still I'm going to first do a registration because I want to show you something. So let's say that I'm doing a registration. So when I do the registration and I add my registration line, during my registration process, you notice that the registration is not, even though my purchase order is still having CS as my warehouse where I'm intended to receive the stock, but still there is a quarantine management process enabled for that item, and there is also a quarantine warehouse setup for this particular warehouse. That's a reason the system automatically registering this particular stock against the CSQ warehouse and not against the CS warehouse. And this is one important thing to notice. And let's say like I'm removing this, I'm not doing the registration, just I'm stopping the registration, and let me just go to my warehouse. Let me first refresh everything. So let me quickly go to my inventory breakdown again. Still loading. Okay, so let's go to the inventory breakdown. That one to this particular warehouse. So let me go here and edit it and remove the quarantine warehouse. Okay, so now after removing it, let me go back to the registration and try to do the registration again. Okay, if I do that, the system knows that there's no quarantine setup, so system automatically warns you that the registration cannot be done because there must be a quarantine warehouse setup. So it's very important that you do the setup before you even get started with your purchase order. So once you do this setup, then now you will be able to quickly do the registration and confirm the registration. So this particular stock is at the moment registered against the quarantine warehouse. Okay, so now going back to your purchase order, so let me now go ahead and I think I did not confirm this, so let me first confirm this purchase order. And receive it. Okay, so that one. So as soon as I receive it, as we discussed during the intro, the item will not be received within your actual warehouse. So if I go to the item here, this one, and if I check my on-hand inventory, you will see that the one stock that we recently received is in the CSQ warehouse and not in the CS warehouse because of our quarantine management setup. So another thing to notice is as soon as you received this particular stock, if I now go into the inventory management, collapse all, periodic task, quality management. So we already reviewed the quality management, this for a thorough inspection. Like as mentioned before, if you just want to do a visual inspection in a segregated location, then an automatic quarantine order will be created. If I get into the quarantine order, you will see that against the item 29, a quarantine order is created. Whenever there is a, it's also possible, just like a quality order, to manually create a quarantine order that we will review later. But when you manually create a quarantine order, you might need to start it manually as well. But since the quarantine order created automatically, it's already started for us. Okay, so one quantity, the quarantine order is already started. So if I go into this particular quarantine order, I will see the lot ID, the cost centers, and the reference of the purchase order, and the quarantine location, and the actual location of the warehouse, and all that we can see here. Okay, and even other very important thing is, if you go into this particular item and check the transactions. Okay, so transactions will be mixed with the other transactions if I see from here, so it might be a little confusing. So what I'll do is I will open the transaction from the quarantine order itself, so it's more clear for you guys. So let me open it from here. Okay, so here if you see, there will be 4 lines of inventory transactions performed. So let's review this one by one. So initially the inventory is actually, we try to receive the inventory into the CS warehouse, because CS warehouse is what we put in the purchase order line, right? So but it actually haven't received within the CS warehouse, it's received within a CSQ, that is quarantine warehouse, right? So that's the reason why the stock is being detected by one from the CS warehouse, and it's now been received into the CSQ warehouse. Okay, so this detection is the detection from the CS warehouse, where we originally intended to receive the stock, but rather it got detected from the CS warehouse and got received into the CSQ warehouse. Maybe I will add the dimension so it's more clear for you. Save it. Okay, so as you can see here, it is detected from the CS warehouse and received into the CSQ warehouse. But we all know that it is temporarily sitting into the CSQ warehouse because it's just going through an inspection process, and it will be soon moving back to the CS warehouse. And that's the reason why it's at the moment being physically reserved within the quarantine warehouse, because it will not be consumed directly from the quarantine warehouse, and at the other side it's been ordered by the CS warehouse, because ultimately it will be received. So it's acting like as if the CS warehouse have created a purchase order and they are waiting for the purchase order to be received. So that's why it is at the moment in the order status, and from the CSQ side it is physically received, because it will be anyways not be consumed from the CSQ warehouse, it will be moved back into the CS warehouse. So these are the 4 different transactions. One is detected from the actual warehouse, received into the CSQ warehouse, ordered from the actual warehouse, ordered to the actual warehouse, and it is at the moment physically reserved within the CSQ warehouse. So these are the 4 different transactions that you will see while the item is sitting in the quarantine order. So let me just have this open and go to another screen and open the quarantine order, so that I can show you the changes in the status. Collapse all periodic quarantine management quarantine order. So that's the quarantine order which is already started. So now the steps are, once we are done with your visual inspection, we are happy with the visual inspection, we can then report this as finished and say okay. So we have reported it as finished, and then we can go ahead and end the process. So as soon as you end the process, that means that your quality order is ended, sorry, the quarantine order is ended, your inspection is over, all the stocks are good enough for you, it will all be moved back to the original warehouse. So if I go to the actual inventory transaction, refresh it now, you will see that it will be sold from the CSQ warehouse and it will be received successfully into your main warehouse. See, it's all sold and it's been purchased by the main warehouse finally. Okay, so that is how the inventory transactions behave for the quarantine warehouse, and this is the quarantine warehouse flow. Very, very simple and easy. Start is already started if it's automatically created, report is finished, end it. Okay, so that's your quarantine order. So we are not going to stop here. We will try to review one more scenario, and in this case we are going to review on what will happen if, let's say that your stocks are partially failing and partially passing, so you want to move the partial stock to a proper location into a warehouse and remaining stock to a special location into your main warehouse so you can return it back to your vendor, right? So how do we do that scenario? Okay, so let's quickly do that scenario. So let me create a purchase order again for the same item. New, vendor, okay, CS, and okay, in this case I'm going to make this quantity as 4, meaning I'm going to receive 4 of them. Okay, let me confirm it. And go ahead and receive all the 4. Okay, so let's receive them all. So now, as usual, quarantine order will be created in the system. So let's go and check the quarantine order. So let me just refresh it. Yeah, so the quarantine order is created for 4 for that particular item, and let's say that out of 4, 2 of them are of a good quality after visual inspection, whereas the other 2 you want to maybe receive them to a different location into your main warehouse so that you can return it back to the vendor. So if you have such scenarios, then you can handle it through the arrival journal. That is let me do that. So here I have 4 and I have a feature called a split here, and there's also a feature where, let's say you want to scrap the remaining 2 directly from the quarantine warehouse. You don't want to move them back to the original warehouse and return it back. You don't have a process of vendor return, rather your vendor gives you permission to quickly scrap it. You can then directly scrap those 2 of them from here. But if you want to move it back to your original warehouse and then return it back, because there is a limitation in D365, just correct me if there are any new features being added, but as far as I am aware of, is if you want to do a vendor return and if there is any failure occurring in the quarantine order, all you can do is you cannot do a vendor return directly from this point, that is from the quarantine warehouse. You might still need to move them to the original warehouse, and then from the original warehouse you need to perform the vendor return. So for that reason, you can probably segregate those failed ones from the quarantine warehouse to a separate location into your main warehouse, and from there you can perform a vendor return. Do comment in this video if there are any new features that I'm not aware of been recently introduced which enable us to directly do the vendor return from the quarantine order, or how do you handle this process in your organization. But in general, we just move it to the real warehouse and only from there we can do the vendor return. So in my case, I'm going to now only do the return of 2, and remaining 2 is good enough for me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this split functionality to split them. So let me say 2, and the system will create another line for the 2 quantity. And I think this one I need to split it to 2, so I have 2 lines with 2 each. So let's say, as I mentioned before, if this 2 I really don't want to do a vendor return, just scrap them, I can directly go here and do the scrapping, and it will be scrapped out of your inventory. But in my case, I'm going to just perform, I want to show you another information on the item arrival journal. So I'm going to assume that I'm going to going to take it back into the main warehouse. Okay, so for that, what we can do is, previously we did report as finished directly and we clicked on OK, right? So instead of doing that, what we can do is we can go to the arrival journal and choose a arrival journal. If you remember, arrival journal, we already discussed it in a very detailed manner in the previous part, so I hope you remember it. To refresh your memory, if you want to just have a look into the arrival journal, you can feel free to go to the arrival journal episode and have a look into it. So you need to put your arrival journal name here, and then this is 2 quantity that I'm trying to receive, right? So say OK. Okay, so as soon as I do so, the system changes this to report as finished, and there is a arrival journal created with the number 21. So let me go to the inventory management module, inventory management, item arrival journal. So system will take me to the item arrival journal 21, which is the same number as this, and that has the our item 21, and the reference here is quarantine order. So we know that this particular arrival is from a quarantine order. So as usual, you know how to do the item arrival. Just validate it, and just remember that this particular thing is still in the report as finished status. Okay, so now I have validated it, everything looks good, so I can now go and add a dimension location to this particular item arrival journal, edit it, and I can say, oh, this item is not location dimension tracked, so location is disabled. But of course you can have an item with a location enabled. In such cases, you can go here, change your location to a specific location, which is a failed location, so you know that you're receiving the failed orders from the quarantine, or you're using failed items from a quarantine order. So that way you can receive it into a separate location. Okay, so then you have your location changed, and then post your item arrival journal. Okay, so if you do so, once the item arrival journal is posted, the quarantine order will be automatically be refreshed to ended. So it will be automatically be ended by the arrival journal. So if I go back here and just refresh it, you see that the another quarantine order we had is gone, because this view is only showing you those which are started and not the ended. So this is ended now. Okay, so the remaining ones which have been passing at the moment do not need to be received into any special location. You really do not want to receive them using arrival journal, for example, then you can just quickly go and without an arrival journal and finish them, and they will be then be ended. So this way you can use an arrival journal to make sure you receive a specific quarantine order into your warehouse location, which I also wanted to show you as a part of today's episode. So hope you now got a good idea about what a quarantine order is and how do we handle it. So that's it for today's episode. In the next episode, we will do little more scenarios and little more understanding about the quarantine management process available in Microsoft Dynamics 365. Until then, bye, and thank you so much for all your support, and thank you so much for watching this episode.